Hi everyone, in this Lightroom tutorial video I'm going to show you how I shape light, increasing the appearance of warm side light. I'll also run through the entire Lightroom edit on this photograph. Stay tuned until later in the video where I show you a powerful tip for quickly converting this image to black and white. Let's get started. The first thing I've done is I've cropped the image, a nice portrait crop. And I want to change the color profile. I want the profile to be a lot flatter. So I'm going to choose a camera matching profile that my camera generated, and that is flat version 2. And then I want to tweak the white balance, keep it quite warm, and then tweak the tint. I just want to make it a little bit more on the magenta side. And then let's start working on the exposure. I like the exposure. I'm going to make it a bit darker. I'm going to use a vignette to darken the outside, but I just want to get a good exposure on the line to start with. Let's increase some nice contrast here. Drop down the highlights quite a bit. I just want to protect those highlights on the outside of the fur, especially on the right-hand side here. Increase the shadows around about there, and maybe increase some of the whites just to bring back a little bit more contrast. And then I'm going to raise the blacks. I like to soften the blacks in a lot of my images, around about there. I'm going to increase the texture and clarity, especially on the lion's face. So I could do that with a mask, but I'm just going to do that globally. Something around about there. And then I'm going to leave the dehaze slider alone. I might increase some of the color a little bit. One thing that's bugging me is this very bright section on the lion's fur here. So I'm just going to create a radial gradient, a thin radial gradient. I'm just going to click and drag it over that area. I want to bring down the highlights just in that section. So it's a very subtle effect, maybe some of the whites, just to drop it down just a bit. Next, I will move into, let's do the tone curve. So I'm going to add a little bit of contrast here, a little bit more into the brights, and probably soften the blacks. I like to soften the blacks in a lot of my images. Something around about like that. As you can see, I'm just raising up that black point, and that is going to create a faded shadow look. And I might just raise up these blacks just a little bit, something like that. Lightroom's got a nice new slider here on the tone curve called Refine Saturation. So if you find that you have increased your contrast in the image and the saturation gets increased too much as well, you can just drop the slider down here. But I'm going to leave that at 100%. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to do is go into the HSL panel. I want to change some of these colors, very subtle changes. I'm going to make the lion's fur a little bit more orange. Something around about there. And then I want to change the green. I want to make the greens a little bit more brown. So I'm going to drop that quite substantially. And I'm just going to mess around with the aqua a little bit here. And the blues maybe a tiny bit. Yeah, it's looking good for the color. It's a before and after. You can just see I've changed that green there to be a bit more browner, which gives a nice effect. Let's move on to the saturation. And here I'm going to drop the saturation of the greens quite a bit because I like the warm colors on this image and I don't like the greens too much. Sometimes the greens give a nice effect, but in this example I'm going to take those greens out. It helps simplify the image by simplifying the color palette. And I'm also going to reduce the purple appearance in the shadow areas here. So I'm going to drop the blues a little bit, maybe drop the purple and magenta. I find quite often with wildlife photography, I'm dropping the purple and magenta quite a lot. So you can see that's created quite a nice change in the color there. It's simplified the color palette. And I might increase the oranges just a touch. Okay, before we get further on into the image, I want to just go into the vignette. I want to darken the outside of the image, to place more emphasis on the line, change the midpoint. Let's increase that a bit. If you hold down Alt and click any of these sliders, you can actually see a 100% preview of the vignette, which is quite nice. I'll just add in a little bit of feather. And then I'm going to use this highlight slider at 100. That's going to eliminate some of the vignettes on the brightest areas of the image. Going to move into color grading next. And this is where I'm going to add in a little bit of blue into the shadows. Around about there. And maybe increase the slider somewhat. So you can see we've made quite a big change to this image now with this color grading. I'm just going to play around with the blending and balance. I like to see what these sliders do. As you can see now, there's a lot of blue in the whole image, but now I'm just going to increase the balance, and that's going to place that blue into very dark shadows. Let's adjust this blending. I think around about there looks good. So you can see we've just added a little bit of color contrast here in the dark areas, a nice little bit of blue there. Okay, before we get into the creative side of light shaping, I just want to go into lens corrections, make sure remove chromatic aberration is checked, and then detail. I'm just going to add a basic sharpening to this image, and normally I use about the amount of 60. I drop the radius. Detail I keep quite low. Let's keep it at 25, and then holding down the Alt button and clicking masking, you can place that sharpening only where you want it. So anything that's white is sharpened. Anything that's black is protected from the sharpening. Now there's not a lot of noise in this image. I'm just going to add a tiny little bit of luminance noise reduction. You can of course use the AI denoise feature in Lightroom, but I'm going to leave it like that for now. So what I want to do now is shape the light. So what I mean by that is I'm going to create an effect of light coming in from the right hand side and create a little bit of shadow on the left hand side. The light on this scene was very soft, but I want to create a more directional appearance for the light. So to do that, I'm first going to darken this left hand side of the line here. And I'm going to do that with a very basic brush. Increase the brush size. And I'm going to drop the exposure probably by about minus 0.25. And I might drop the white balance just a little bit there to create a little bit of a blue look to the shadows. It's just a setting I'll start with. I might tweak it a little bit now. I can see the image on that side is looking a bit too blue, so I'm going to raise that white balance. But that's looking good for now. Maybe increase that white balance just a little bit there. Maybe darken it a little bit more. So you can see with just that small effect, we've created that look of shadow on the left-hand side. What I'm going to do is I don't want to necessarily darken the eyes there. The eyes are reflecting the direction the line is looking, so it looks unnatural that that left-hand eye is a bit darker. So I'm going to subtract a brush. I'm just going to zoom in. I'm just going to take that effect away from the eye there. So that's a look at that little darkening effect. Maybe it's a bit much. I might just increase the exposure just a touch. That's looking good. Before we create the light on the right hand side, I want to just go and affect these eyes quickly, and I like to increase the exposure on the horizon in the reflection of the eye there. So you can see that very bright area. I'm going to increase the exposure. So I just add a bit of white, add a bit of exposure, make the brush nice and small. Let's just click that on to see what we are doing. That gives nice definition to the eye there. So that is before and after. Let's just turn that off. It's before and after. It might be a bit much. So let's just drop that a little bit. It's a nice technique, so you don't have to brighten the whole eye. You just brighten that very bright horizon there. It's also looking a bit too strong, but I might add some saturation. And what I like to do sometimes, the overall appearance of this image is very warm. So I might drop the white balance on that eye reflection there. You can see, hopefully you can see that's getting nice and blue. That's overdone. So just by dropping the white balance temperature, I'm just going to add a little bit of blue there. That helps separate that very bright area from the warmth of the eye, just by adding a little bit of blue. Just looking back at these eyes, I think I've overdone it a bit. So mask 3, I'm just going to drop the amount, just so it's very subtle. Okay, so now what I want to do is add a radial gradient, a very large radial gradient. So I'm actually going to zoom out a bit. I want to affect very softly the right hand side of the image. This is where I'm going to add in that light coming from the right. Warm it up a bit. And I might add a very soft amount of dehaze, just to soften that up a bit. So you can see we've created that little bit of light on the side there. And what I think I'm going to do is, this image is looking a little bit bright, so I'm going to darken it overall. And then I'm going to add in a little bit more light on the right, just with a brush. I'm going to paint on the lion's face. Increase the exposure just a little bit, and maybe a little bit of warmth. Just to increase the appearance of that warm side light coming through there. What you can do here is just paint it on this whole entire side that is facing the light. Making sure to get the fur and the ears here. For this to work and appear natural, you need that cool shadow and the warm highlight there. Let's just turn that on and off. You can see what it's done. I think that's looking pretty good. And I'm liking the look of that. So now what I want to do is I want to create a black and white version of this. And a lot of the time when I edit my images, I like to create a black and white version just to see what it looks like. So I'm going to right click on the image here, create virtual copy. And on this virtual copy, I'm going to create a black and white version. And now in Lightroom, you have this black and white tab here. The problem with this one is if you are creating a black and white version of your image after you have already edited the image, it potentially adds in a lot of contrast. So you can see I've balanced the light very well in this image. Now, if I click this black and white here, it's going to create a ton of contrast that I don't really want. I want to keep the contrast in the image, but I want to desaturate it. So basically what I'm going to do is I'm just going to drop the saturation. So now the contrast is the same of the color image, and it's a nicer platform to start adjusting this black and white version. I want to do a few things to the image, especially remove a lot of this color grading. It was quite blue on this black and white version, so I'm going to adjust that there. So what I think I'm going to do now is I'm going to increase the exposure a little bit. And maybe drop down some of this contrast. And then maybe fade the blacks a little bit more here. Maybe bring in some more highlights just to add in a bit more contrast. And what I might do then is increase more of the vignette. And then maybe drop the blacks a little bit just to make it a bit more darker, a bit more dramatic. Click on the screen here to check out the full Lightroom edit on this wildlife photograph.